Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman. And today we're going to have one of our periodic updates about how AI is doing as a
How
coder.
what's doing? Sorry.
How AI,
How
how
AI is
recovering
doing?
from pneumonia is sucks and is very slow.
Ah, yeah. The AI episode. I think the reason I wanted to kind of do another one of these, we've done a couple at this point. We've talked
We've
about
done at
AI in
least
different.
two, maybe three.
Yeah, and I guess there was some recent news from Meta. They were going to like eventually lay off some employees that were like junior to mid level because they were thinking that soon um, their AIs could essentially replace the work that the lesser, lower tier, whatever engineers were doing. Um, and it kind of got me reflecting on like how much AI has improved since the explosion of OpenAI and AI in
Oh, yeah,
general.
it's hugely different. It's gone from being a good auto, like an expanded autocomplete or
Yeah.
type ahead, to I've got a friend who works in finance and he was telling me about this AI called Devin, where he has a code base that does trading. He has a library for a thing called Fix, which is a standard protocol in the finance industry.
Hmm.
And he told Devin, "Here's our code base. Here's the library. Here's the spec. Build me an integration with end-to-end tests."
Hmm.
And it did. And it apparently churned away for like 8 hours,
Hmm.
but it did. It made the thing, and it wrote documentation.
Mm. Nice.
Um, and he said it was pretty good. It had end-to-end test. He was actually able to send orders to the exchange and get responses back, uh, which is also a helpful thing because then I assume this AI was also doing that. It was like, oh, well, does this work? I'm going to try against the system that I'm integrating with. Uh,
That's cool.
and that certainly, covers the ground of, well, I could replace a junior to mid-level developer with that. But I think there's a couple of important constraints there. But first of all, it's 10 grand a month. So
Mm.
it's certainly not cheaper. Well, maybe it's a little cheaper than a junior developer, but it's not cheap. The second constraint is this is a situation where he had a good code base, which, in the future, everyone maybe will have good code bases, but right now we don't. Uh,
Yeah.
he had a spec and he had a library that was well tested. And so
Mm.
it was a very defined and deterministic piece of work.
Yeah. That's a great call out, actually, because I think I've tried doing a similar thing in a manual fashion, not using this other AI you mentioned. But I've tried like using a code base that was like a really well tested one and just writing better tests for it.
Hmm.
And I've tried code bases that were had zero test coverage, but the code was really well structured,
Hmm.
small functions and that kind of thing.
I bet that worked better.
It worked very well. Yeah. And then I tried legacy code, old applications, and boy, oh boy, if your code is already a mess, it struggles. It'll give you some solutions that do work um, without regarding the other downstream impacts of it. And you can also kind of trick it sometimes. It
Hmm.
wants to please you. So there's like I was thinking about this upgrade I was doing recently where I was moving from PHP 7.3 to 8.3. And there's a deprecated function called money underscore format. They
That sounds
replaced it with
dangerous.
number underscore format. And the money format one, you can set a locale and it'll print out like USD. It'll automatically, depending on the situation, it'll print out like uh, like a dollar sign and comma separated with the thousands places and that kind of thing. And you can do that with number format as well, but you have to specify how many decimal places, what the number separator is, because you could be separating the thousands with like a period instead of a comma. So essentially, as you move to the other function,
Hmm.
um, you you have to consider, oh, how was the old one behaving? Was locale set such that it was automatically formatting it and using the comma? If
Mm.
it wasn't set, what was the default behavior? And so I copied the old function and pasted in there, and asked it to give me the new version of this, and it gave me the number format version. Um, and it gave me the correct one, like to match exactly, because the way the way the amount was formatting was just no commas, a
Mm.
period, and two decimal places. No dollar sign, no USD thing or anything. The first time it gave it to me correctly, then I asked it, hey, did the old one actually use thousands separators or not? And did we need to consider that for this port? And it was like, oh, yeah, my mistake. And then, corrected itself and gave me the actual wrong answer. The first answer was correct, but because I questioned it, not in a way of correcting it, but because I was unsure,
Mm.
it tried to overcorrect and gave me the wrong one. And so either way, it still works much better than it did, especially at writing great test coverage, than it did a year ago when I tried it.
Oh
But
yeah.
it's it's got some flaws, but it's certainly picking up the pace, and I could see how people, especially people who are not really in the tech industry, are like, oh, the human developers done for, it's over, game
It's
over.
that's very much the wrong way to think about it.
Hmm.
I was talking to some developer friends of mine, and they said a much better way to think about it is 50 years ago they started bringing in compilers. So originally everybody wrote in assembly, and
Hmm.
you had to, think in terms of registers and shifting and all of these really low level skills. And they brought in compilers, and the early compilers did not work particularly well. They made mistakes. They would be slower than if you rolled your own assembly.
Hmm.
And so there was a long transition, maybe a decade or so, where the compilers got better and fewer and fewer developers were coming up who knew assembly at all. And
Mm.
this transition of, oh, well, yeah, maybe assembly's better in some cases, where now, 50 years later, everyone's like, why would you do assembly unless you're dealing with something really weird?
Yeah.
Because now the compilers don't make mistakes. And their point of view was the same thing is going to happen with AI. It's like it's the next level up of abstraction up from a compiler. And it's not that developers are going away, it's developers are going to need to formalize their thoughts and be
Hmm.
able to formalize their thoughts much stronger.
Yeah.
Like you can't say, build me a thing that does this and it'll take a guess. You got to be able to say, okay, I need you to build me a something and then talk about a model to it, right? I need a singleton, which apparently singletons are deprecated, don't do them. But like, I need a factory to build these kinds of things, and I need it to do this, and I need that, and it will build that for you. And it
Hmm.
probably won't be as fast as if you wrote the code yourself. The code won't be as fast as if you wrote it yourself, but you'll be able to write so much more code that it would offset
Mm.
that.
Interesting. That kind of reminds me of the people writing sloppier, less performant code once they had plenty of memory and CPU to work with.
The
You
same
know,
thing.
yeah.
This will be the same thing of, the AI will write the code and it won't be as good as if a human wrote the code, but that's okay because it's not, you just get so much more code. But the
Right.
idea that developers are going to go away is wrong, just like the idea that developers are going to go away when you switch from assembler to compilers. Like there's a long history of, um, I forget what the word, natural language,
Mm.
natural language programming languages, where it's like, oh, well, you just write it in English and then the compiler compiles it into code and it works. And so anybody could do it. It's like, well, no, no, no.
Yeah.
You anybody can work the syntax because it's English, but you still need to be able to think that way.
Yep. Yep. Well, an interesting thing too, to your friend that ended up writing this or using this $10,000 a month system that in 8 hours wrote pretty good tests. If in 8 hours it did a better job than in 8 hours a junior to mid-level developer would have done
Hmm.
and did more work, then that's where people are raising their eyebrows, right? Because it might be $10,000 a month, but if it's, think of how much you pay for a mid to junior uh, developer
Hmm.
for them not to give you maybe full 8 hours of work, or to not be able to work 24 hours a day writing code for you while you sleep, you know.
Well,
And
I
then
would
that
flip it
costs getting
around.
cheaper too.
Like, I've never worked at a company where all of the developers didn't have, like, there wasn't months worth of work lined
Hmm.
up for all of the developers at all time.
Yeah.
And so the way I would say it is, if I suddenly had something, a tool that was going to make me 5 times more productive,
Hmm.
maybe that's enough that in the short run you could get rid of a few developers. But in the long run, it just means we're going to write more software, and all those features that
Yeah.
never get written because they are of the lower marginal value will get written, and so software
Hmm.
will become more complete, uh,
Yeah.
and it will iterate faster. Right? It won't be like, oh well, yes, this website needs a facelift, but it ain't broke, and
Yeah.
so we'll just let it run for 5 years before we update it. Whereas now, in the near future, I imagine you could take an AI and say, here is the website we have today. It's doing a React style with it. There's an API layer,
Hmm.
there's React. Here's the new style guide. Update the website.
Yeah. And I can see not just the updates, but like imagine a case where it can, kind of fix itself, write tests for itself, get, full coverage, then find code that was inefficient and rewrite that code against the test coverage. And then, if it passes, yay, now we got a more efficient
Mm-hmm.
loop. And the first time they did it, it was just writing it. And the second time it did it was a more efficient algorithm. If we have a case where, let's just pretend that's true, and you can just make a system more complete and more efficient by itself, uh, then I could see a world where we're prioritizing all the new competitive features and ideation of new concepts and ways to distinguish our company as being separate from another
Mm-hmm.
company or our competitor. You're dreaming up more things to build and make yourself separate, and spending less time stabilizing and bug fixing and testing your system, because you're able to have that done by this pretend, again, this is theoretical, by this system that can, just handle a lot of those things for you. So imagine all the time you spend bug fixing and writing tests and optimizing poor queries. Imagine not having to do any of that, and or we have a AI that does that good enough that now we just need to get in the room and
Right.
come up with distinguishing features that AI
Right.
wasn't able to come up with.
Well, and it'll get down to thinking about what code is and how it's supposed to work, and being able to write up a spec and
Hmm.
being able to define a library. Those will become the main characteristics of the developer.
Yeah.
Um, in the case of Meta, they also said, they said that they expect to lay off junior mid-level developers soon, but they also said they're instituting, um, what was it, stack ranking, what was it, stack and yank, where they're just going to cut the bottom 5% of their bottom 5%
Oh
of
yeah.
performers every year to create new headcount so that they can hire new people. Yeah, which is a thing. Like it's
Yeah.
in
I,
finance and consultancies, they do
yeah.
that.
I was
It's
going to ask, like, essentially, if you keep cutting the mid to junior people, then you don't get new senior people. No one ever gets a chance to learn,
well,
unless
that's
you
what
rotate
the
like that.
last Hollywood strike was about.
Hmm.
Uh, in our case, I think the junior and mid level people will, again, the analogy I'm going to use is it's similar with a compiler, where the new junior and mid level people aren't going to know how to write assembler, and they're not going to be great at these
Yeah.
juniors. They're not going to be good at writing code. They're going to be good at thinking in terms of models and writing down specs and
Exactly. Yeah.
doing the documentation to obtain so that the AI can build it for them. And those are
Hmm.
actually really rare skills today. Like if you tell most developers that I've ever worked with, hey, you need to document this. Like this is an API, you need to document it, and the general response I get is the code is the documentation,
Hmm.
and I would reply to that, well, no, this is a 300-line function. It ain't shit. But
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before. Basically, like, what does it mean to be a junior developer in a world of AI? Essentially, that was one of our last. Well, I mean, not our last one, but it was one of the ones we talked about. But just the
yeah.
idea of like, what does our role look like? What is developers' roles shift towards? And I do think is what
Mm-hmm.
you're talking about, that more human aspect of understanding why this thing needs to work, like the problem that it's solving for the end user,
Mm-hmm.
and then being able to write really excellent specs for defining that. And if someone can program an AI well enough that they're essentially copying and pasting code just like today we do with Stack Overflow when we don't know something, then that's just as
It's
valuable.
totally
If
valid. But
yeah.
why would you hate on that?
All right.
Yeah.
Well, any other comments on that one for now? I think what we'll end up doing is, maybe every 6 months we'll take another look and see what's
Take another look.
changed.
See if the AI overlords have come for us yet.
They get closer and closer.
They are getting closer. I turned off my Copilot
Mm.
many months ago because I work in a very dirty code base, and it
Hmm.
would get confused.
Yeah, I
And
can imagine.
it's like, oh, I'm writing new code, and it's like, oh, here's code that would work. I'm like, oh, no, no, no. Copilot, that's the 2015 variant. And it's like, oh, well,
Right.
here, try this. I'm like, no, 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 that's the 2020 variant. I need you to write this like it's 2024 or
Yeah.
better. Uh,
All right.
anyway, thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.